Hello and welcome to Newswire. I am Jawad Tehami. The entire globe is in the grip of novel coronavirus and the countries are trying hard to contain the pandemic. But a country which houses the second largest population in the world seems not only failing miserably this front, but to divert the global attention from its own failure, it is resorting to its belligerence with its neighbor Pakistan. In the last couple of days, Indian forces have targeted civilians deliberately, murdering one and wounding 12 others along the line of control and the working boundary. During the ongoing global crisis, India has blatantly flouted the bilateral ceasefire agreement as well as the United Nations call for a universal ceasefire to contain the COVID-19. Pakistan's forces have responded befittingly to India's aggression, targeting the forces' posts. Pakistan Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi says India is committing injustice in Kashmir. To talk more about this, we are joined today by Lieutenant General retired Ashraf Saleem, an analyst from Lahore, and Mr. Muzzamil Thakur, analyst from London. Thank you very much for your time at Newswire today. I'll start the discussion with you, General Saleem. There have been over 700 ceasefire violations by Indian forces at the line of control and the working boundary during this year alone. What does India want from these violations?
I think the basic objective of Indians is that they just want to divert the attention of the world from their internal situation, and they just want to create some kind of issue at the LOC so that they can pretend to the world that everything is okay inside Kashmir, inside Indian-occupied Kashmir. But what is wrong is only at the LOC. Remaining everything is honky-dory with them. India's internal issues, particularly after they brought this Citizen Act and Registration Act and all that, there have been many issues within India. And now recently, those issues have been exacerbated by the onset of coronavirus. And people are suffering, particularly after the recent lockdown in India for about 21 days, which was extended by another 2 weeks. So this is the basic issue. And this kind of lockdown has created many issues for Indians. Many, I think millions of labor has been displaced. They just said some of them are walking to their homes as far as Allahabad from Delhi and so many other places. So India just wants to divert the world attention to violations on LOC, nothing else.
So, General Saleem, you are of the view that India is trying to divert the attention from its own failures, that it is not able to contain the situation, neither in India within itself and also in occupied Kashmir. I'll come to you, Mr. Thakur. What do you think? Why has there been so many ceasefire violations at the line of control and the working boundary? In this year alone, over 700 have been registered. And what exactly is the intention behind these ceasefire violations by India?
Well, as you mentioned, there have been more than 700. It's clear that India wants to divert that attention. I agree with General Saleem. But at the same time, you have to remember that by diverting that attention to the line of control, they're also instigating Pakistan to react. And that is where the crux of the issue is, that when India attacks Pakistan or it infiltrates or it commits some kind of force or aggression in Azad Kashmir or Pakistan, the world attention doesn't really react that much. But the moment Pakistan responds in kind, as it should, that is an issue. So it is India instigating Pakistan so that they can take Pakistan to the world stage and attempt to discredit Pakistan. But of course that will never work, because we know that the movement for Kashmir, the just movement for Kashmir, is an honest one. It is a correct one. It is an international and a legal argument that we have. So irregardless of what India attempts to malign Pakistan with, ultimately the world already knows that India is one of the largest human rights violators in the world.
Okay, Mr. Thakur, can we have a correlation between the number of ceasefire violations which have increased at LOC, which you mentioned that India is trying to instigate Pakistan, and since the time Narendra Modi came into power?
Of course, Modi's agenda overall has always been a Hindutva nation, a pan-Hindu nation that is not just limited to the Indian borders. It goes beyond Indian borders into Pakistan, into Afghanistan, even into Iran. So this ideology that the RSS and BJP, the right-wing fascist, imperialistic, neo-colonial BJP party have, and the RSS that backs them, once they have been in power, these instigations against Pakistan have increased exponentially, simply for the reason not just to malign Pakistan, but also in their open attempt, in their open aggression to create that pan-Hindu nation, to absorb Pakistan into India, to absorb Nepal, Bangladesh, Iran, Afghanistan into India. And they've attempted that in many different forms. We've seen the way that India have invested millions, if not billions, into Afghanistan, and it has failed. America still requires the Pakistan nation in that part of the world, in Afghanistan, to help them in exiting Afghanistan. And India's attempts at infiltration into Afghanistan and investments to create a power corridor that, or a power nexus that would be needed for America, it hasn't worked. So that has been a failure. And because of that failure, that economic failure, that political failure, now India are attempting military aggression so that they can have their way. Unfortunately, it won't work.
Okay, I'll take this point to Saleem. Do you think that this Hindu supremacist ideology, the torchbearer of which is BJP in India, do you think this fascism is giving any sort of a benefit to India on any sort of a front?
Yeah, they think that way because ultimately their objective seems to be that within India, they would like to get rid of 25 crores of Muslims. Not only Muslims, but there are a lot many other majorities like Sikhs, Christians and others, including their own lower caste Dalits. Now, they may try this, but with this kind of large minority, which goes to almost 20% of the population, will India be able to eliminate them or maim them to an extent where they're converted back to Hinduism? I don't think it is possible in this world where the world is so connected. The Muslims cannot be subjugated that way. Ultimately, India will create problems for themselves. And they will not only create problems for themselves, but they're going to destabilize the whole region, South Asia, and ultimately it may spill over to other areas surrounding South Asia. So that is where the world must be concerned about. And India, particularly BJP, being a fascist, Naziist ideological party, they are trying to adopt to those measures where they can really go for minorities and really, just kill them, eliminate them within the Indian polity. But I think, despite the fact that recently, about 2 days back, Indian BJP government, they had announced that they are not going to immediately act on those provisions of Citizen Act and all that, but they have not abandoned it totally. They are going to continue with their efforts, and they will create issues, they will create problems for this whole region. I would even go beyond that. In fact, this region is not only South Asia. The entire Indian Ocean region is going to be destabilized by this kind of ideology which is propagated by BJP. I think it is going to be a lot of trouble for this region, and the world must take cognizance of this, especially the superpowers.
So, General Saleem, you're of the view that these sort of overtures which are being carried out by India is going to trouble the entire region and the world at large as well. And in return, it is going to disturb Indians themselves. Days before, Pakistan forces shot down quadcopter, and then Indian forces started deliberately targeting the civilians on Pakistani side from across the LOC. Does it depict, is it evident of the frustration in Indian camps?
Oh, certainly. It is all frustration. No, this kind of activity of flying quadcopters across the LOC, over the LOC, previously they used to fly the reconnaissance aircraft and other reconnaissance missions. Now, since with the new technologies coming in, quadcopters and all that, carrying cameras, they can use them. And this has been a practice since very long. this is what they are doing. And this kind of frustration along the LOC is not something new. This has been going on. The only problem is that on our side, we have civilian population, where when they don't find any other target, because Pakistan military doesn't represent them that kind of target. They just see innocent civilians working in their fields and they start firing on them. And they have been using not only small arms, but at times they go on to mortars and artillery guns, which creates not many casualties on our side. Our problem is that we cannot retaliate in the same coin against the civilians on the other side, because those civilians, they also belong to us. They are Kashmiris. So we Pakistani armed forces, they have to be very careful. And that's how we select only the military targets.
So, General Saleem, how do you think Pakistani forces have responded until now? Because there are civilians on the other side of LOC and the working boundary, and they are very much part and parcel of Pakistan. So, has there been a very calibrated and calculated response from Pakistani side?
Oh yes. We always do that. This is what I was saying. We do not target, we do not kill the civilians on the other side. We select Indian bunkers, we select Indian military targets on the other side, and very precisely, I would say in a very targeted way, we target their military targets and we cause a lot of damage, which in fact doesn't attract that kind of press on their side, because Indians, they hide their casualties. If they had been civilian casualties, probably they would have been known. But since they are military casualties on the other side, that's how they are not that well known. And Indian media is also not that well, I would say, aware of those casualties, and the things remain hidden. But just listen to what the ISPR says. ISPR on our side, we exactly know how many casualties have been caught, what kind of damage has been done on the side. We even go to the extent of making their videos. So we know what damage has been done, and that's what our response has always been very, very calibrated, very measured, and very targeted.
Yes, General Saleem, Mr. Thakur already pointed out a very important thing, that when India resorts to fighting and ceasefire violations, it tries to instigate Pakistan. And that in turn, when Pakistan forces respond to this aggression, they make a huge propaganda on this thing. I'll go to Mr. Thakur. When the entire world is in the grip of COVID-19 pandemic, and especially the Western countries and the United Nations and its agencies are focused in dealing with that pandemic, do you think India is trying to take advantage of their focus inward and trying to instigate Pakistan because of that thing, and the Western countries and the United Nations can't condemn Indian aggression at this point in time?
Of course. Look, when they removed Article 370-35A in Kashmir to hide the antagonistic nature and hide the human rights violations that are happening, they decided to launch their CAA-NRC bill. And then they had problems in Delhi, Mumbai, and the rest of India. And then suddenly the COVID-19 virus happened, and suddenly everybody's locked inside. So even that's been covered. The same way they use one crisis to hide another crisis, to hide another crisis. And that's exactly what's happened with this issue as well, that COVID-19 is giving them a cover to pass different resolutions, different laws, different bills, and even commit acts of atrocities on the LOC. Let's also remember that only recently that they passed the Domicile Act in Kashmir, which allows non-Kashmiris to reside in Kashmir, and essentially creating demographic change. So this is something that has always been part of Indian strategy, to cover up their crimes by committing another crime and then implying that somebody else has done it. But let's also remember that whatever India is doing on the LOC and whatever aggression that they have committed, at Pakistan's response that has been, India have started to reuse human shields in Kashmir. They have infiltrated and they have gone into civilian locations, civilian populations, so that the Pakistani forces, when they respond to the Indian aggression, but that is the responsibility of the Indian forces, and this is a form of human rights, not only human rights violations, it is a war crime. It is a crime against humanity to be in civilian populations and then perform acts of war against Pakistan and then instigate Pakistan to fire back and then kill civilians. So this is a war crime on India's part, to use the civilians as human shields, and then they will take this issue to the United Nations, to the Geneva Convention, to the European Parliament, to the British Parliament, to the American Senate, and then imply that, look what Pakistan are doing, they are killing civilians. The question should always be, why are the Indian army in civilian populations?
So, Mr. Thakur, you've just mentioned the plight of the Kashmiris over there, and the Indian forces are committing war crimes. As we have seen certain reports that the COVID-19 cases in Kashmir are also rising, and the valley has been under curfew and complete communication blackout from last over 250 days now. Now this is increasing the plight of the Kashmiris over there. There have been reports that there are no testing facilities and no appropriate and inadequate medical facilities in the occupied valley.
I mean, Kashmir is always going to die one way or the other. If it's not by bullets and pellets, and if it's not by rape and torture, then it's going to be by COVID-19. For the Indian government, this is a blessing in disguise. People can be killed without even using a bullet. So, but we must remember that at this stage in the international world, everybody is running and rushing to the aid of the less privileged, to the aid of those that have limited resources, by giving them PPE, personal protection equipment, by ventilators, by clothing and various different things that medical doctors will need to protect lives. Everybody in the world, no matter where they are doing this, except in Kashmir. And it is the responsibility of the international community to make sure that the people of Kashmir that are suffering, that are under occupation, that are already malnutrition, that are already suffering in some of the worst ways, that they too survive this COVID-19 virus. And if the Indian government allows this virus to spread inside Kashmir, then this is another form of human rights violations. It is another form of crimes against humanity and another form of ethnic cleansing and genocide.
The international community should take cognizance of the brutalities and the atrocities which are being committed by Indian forces in Kashmir as well. It is high time that the United Nations and the Western powers take cognizance of this and let the Kashmiris have all the facilities inside the valley to combat the COVID-19 pandemic. Mr. Muzzamil Thakur, analyst, joined us from London, and Lieutenant General Ashraf Saleem was joining us from Lahore. Thank you very much for your time. With this, we come to the end of the first segment of the show. In the second segment, we'll discuss the political stalemate in Israel, but after a short break, stay tuned. Welcome back to Newswire. I'm Jawad Tehami. The political stalemate in Israel continues as the two major parties, Likud and the Blue and White, struggle to form a unity government to fight the COVID-19 outbreak. President Reuven Rivlin has turned down Blue and White party's leader, Benny Gantz, a request for a 2-week extension to form a new coalition government. Earlier, Gantz said additional time is required for an understanding to be finalized. Netanyahu has also called for an immediate resumption of the talks in an atmosphere of goodwill. President Rivlin declined the request, saying the extension would not be possible under the current circumstances. Did COVID-19 save Netanyahu and weaken Gantz's position? Is Israel heading towards a possible 4th consecutive election in just over a year? To take a deeper look into this, we are joined today by Mr. Emmanuel, a political scientist and foreign policy expert from IFRAD. Thank you for your time. I'll start with this, that why do you think Benny Gantz requested for extension, and what irritants still remain to be settled between him and Netanyahu to form a unity government?
Well, the reason why Benny Gantz asked for an extension was to try and gain time. Because what happened is that in the past few days, even though an agreement had been reached between Netanyahu and Gantz, it looks like Netanyahu started walking away from the agreement by basically threatening Gantz not to form this unity government, hoping that there would be more defections on the center left to join a right-wing coalition, and Gantz would be losing any leverage on Netanyahu, which is why he asked for an extension. But the president said, and rightly so, in my opinion, that there is no point for it. Either both men reach an agreement, or the Knesset will have to take back the mandate and designate another candidate. We all know, and the president knows, that neither Benny Gantz nor Benjamin Netanyahu has a 61 majority, and therefore it's either a unity government or going to another snap election.
Mr. Navon, after winning the second March elections there, when Benny Gantz had support of other parties to oust Netanyahu, and Netanyahu was indicted because of certain things that he was accused of. So why was Benny Gantz not able to take the advantage of that mandate and not form a government of his own?
Because Benny Gantz did not actually have a majority. Yes, 61 MKs out of 120 did recommend him to the president to form a government, but 2 of those MKs also announced that they would not vote in favor of a 61 government that would rely on the joint list of Arab parties. And therefore, Benny Gantz did have 61 recommendations, but he did not have 61 MKs that would have approved such a government. And therefore, he did not have any other choice but to join a unity, or to try at least to join a unity government with Netanyahu.
So, Mr. Navon, when COVID-19 intervened amid all this, whatever the political thing was going on in Israel, do you think this gave a respite or helped Netanyahu to get himself secured for some more time through his fear-mongering, appearing before the cameras, a warning of the dire consequences of the pandemic in country? And he also alluded to that at least 20,000 people could become the victim of COVID-19 pandemic.
Well, the COVID-19 pandemic is a world pandemic. As you know, it's obviously not only an Israeli problem. Israel has been ranked the safest country in the world at this point to be regarding the pandemic. And so I do believe that the Israeli government, the caretaker government, has been handling the crisis pretty well. But definitely this pandemic is one of the reasons why Benny Gantz took the decision to take a risk politically and form a unity government, because this crisis requires unity between the two sides of the parliament, a unity government to handle this crisis, which also has economic consequences, with about 20% of the workforce in Israel being out of work, when our unemployment rate used to be less than 4%. And therefore, we need a state budget to handle this economic crisis. And for that, we need a government, we need a coalition. And it is indeed urgent. The deadline to form such a coalition is tonight, Israel time at 12 p.m. And I very much hope that both leaders will reach such an agreement, because the country needs it.
Okay. As Netanyahu faces corruption charges in connection with 3 separate cases, but the hearing or the court proceedings were postponed until at least 24th of May because of the coronavirus outbreak. Don't you think it actually gave a breather to Netanyahu?
Well, you have to understand that by Israeli law, a prime minister does not have to resign if he's indicted, but only if he's convicted. And this is why the prime minister is able to continue to serve, and even would be able to form a government even though he's been indicted, because, as I said, by law in Israel, a prime minister only has to resign if he's convicted. The hearing will proceed in May. The procedure will take many years. It will be a long court case. And technically, again, the prime minister can continue to serve, which is part of the coalition agreement that was being negotiated between Blue and White and the Likud, an agreement in which the prime minister, despite his court case, despite his indictment, would serve for a year and a half, and then Benny Gantz for another year and a half.
So do you think Mr. Benjamin Netanyahu has been vigilant about the pandemic and its dire consequences it could have on the country, and that has been appreciated by the public at large?
I think that most polls in Israel show that the public at large indeed appreciates the way the prime minister has been handling this crisis, even though there have been some mishaps and some mistakes made, and there's criticism about it. But I would say that overall, I believe most Israelis think that Netanyahu has been doing a pretty good job handling this crisis. But I think it's also very clear that for this crisis to be really handled properly, you need a properly elected government. And as I said before, a state budget that would enable the government to disperse the sums that are required in order to keep the Israeli economy going despite this crisis. And as I said, again, that means that even though the job done so far is more than decent, it cannot be done properly without a functioning and elected government.
So for that, Mr. Navon, does a fourth consecutive election seems imminent?
I very much hope not. As I said before, I very much hope that both Netanyahu and Gantz will put the interest of the country before political calculations, and that they will sign a coalition agreement by tonight at midnight. And I think that pushing the country towards a fourth election in itself would be irresponsible, but definitely during the pandemic crisis of the coronavirus, it would simply be criminal and unforgivable.
Mr. Emmanuel Navon, analyst and political scientist and foreign policy expert, was joining us from Efrat. Thank you for your time. And now I'll go to Mr. Guy Burton, who is a Middle East expert. He's joining us from Brussels. Mr. Burton, thank you very much for your time. What's your opinion about the political stalemate in Israel? And President Rivlin has declined the request of Benny Gantz for an extension of 2 weeks in order to negotiate on more terms to form a unity government in Israel.
Yes, well, thank you very much for having me on your show. Essentially, what we have here is the president having said that time is up. It's been a month to try and find some kind of agreement. He's really trying to put pressure on the two sides, both Netanyahu on the one side and Gantz on the other, try to get them to reach an agreement. From what we understand, they pretty much agreed most, except there seems to be some differences when it comes to judicial appointments. Obviously, Netanyahu would like to have some kind of control over that in order to ensure that he doesn't necessarily have to face the courts, since he is currently under indictment for a investigation for a number of reasons relating to corruption in public life.
So, Mr. Burton, Gantz was of the view that in no way it was possible for a partnership with a prime minister who is indicted. But then COVID-19 outbreak intervened. Do you think COVID-19 actually gave a breather to Benjamin Netanyahu to have more time and turn the tables over?
Yes, well, certainly. I mean, Netanyahu from the start has pretty much been pushing for an emergency government over the last few weeks. And if anything, over the last few weeks, his position has strengthened, because obviously Gantz's position was never to make an agreement with Netanyahu. He's pretty much been talking about that for the last year. So when he then was revealed to be in negotiations with him last month, that split his party and has put him in a much weaker position. And during the course of that time, Netanyahu, as sort of the acting prime minister, has seen his own position, his own ratings increase, which is actually a reflection of some of political leaders, heads of governments around the world. Overall, most governments have seen polling figures go up. But of course, if this continues and goes on further, that may well sort of challenge, Netanyahu's position.
So do you think that Netanyahu has used this whole situation very skillfully for his own advantage?
Well, Netanyahu has been a very good political operator. I mean, it's for no accident that he has now been sort of the longest serving Israeli prime minister. And I think some of the analysis that's coming out of Israel points to the fact that, he has political nous, he has the knowledge on how to exploit the situation. Whereas Benny Gantz, he is a military man. He was the head of the armed forces, and so in some ways he is quite a neophyte when it comes to politics. Certainly, there are a number of options available on the table, and one of the things that Netanyahu's been doing is trying to peel off support from those who from those within the Knesset who feel that Gantz has betrayed him.
Okay, Mr. Burton, do you think that Netanyahu has been able to win the trust of the public back after he told them that at least over 20,000 people could be the victims of COVID-19 and the government is responding well?
Yeah. Well, at the moment, he's, as I mentioned before, polling figures show that around 70% of the Israeli public thinks that Netanyahu is doing a good job. Obviously, that goes up much higher within his party. And if that was to translate into, another election result, that would actually see his party increase its share of the vote, increase the numbers for its political party, as well as the wider political right, which would actually make the need to negotiate for a government redundant. But of course, we're not there yet. The Israeli president has not called for new elections. What he's saying is, he wants to put it back, not necessarily to Gantz or to Netanyahu, but to someone else who can find a majority within the Knesset, and that would take another 3 weeks. So we're not yet at a stage where another election is likely. And if another election did happen, it wouldn't necessarily need to take place until September at the latest. So there is still time for, many people don't really know what the situation is when it comes to COVID-19, how much longer the lockdown is going to go on. So maybe by September, we're talking about a different political situation entirely. Like I said, if the election was to be held tomorrow, Netanyahu would do very well. But of course, as you pointed out, the situation is changing. We have 11,000 cases of COVID-19 in Israel at the moment, and there's been a significant number that we've breached the 100 dead threshold. Over the next couple of months, it could also be problematic for Netanyahu, especially if the Israeli government isn't able to sort of get to grips with the public health crisis, which it is.
So, Mr. Burton, do you think that there is a likelihood of both the Likud and the Blue and White Party forming a unity government by today and before the deadline ends?
Yeah, well, and that is what I think the purpose of the deadline made by President Rivlin is, to try and knock heads. And certainly it seems, that both Likud and Blue and White, or at least what remains of Blue and White under Gantz, have put out a joint statement that they're in talks. So we see them, it may well be that, it's just one or two hurdles that need to be overcome. But in other areas, they seem to have sort of managed to reach agreement. The question is whether they can do it by the end of today. Maybe this might be what needs to be done in order to get them over the line.
Okay, Mr. Burton, please hold with us. I'm now joined by Mr. Jafar, Ramini, analyst and author and political commentator, joining us from Perth. Thank you for your time. How do you see the whole political situation and the stalemate in Israel?
It has been a mess for the last year or so, and it's all about power play and power grab. Mr. Netanyahu knows that his days are numbered. He is an indicted criminal, and he will do everything in his power to keep the status quo going, which what I mean is the confusion going, especially now that Israel is under attack by this coronavirus. And they are trying to do everything in their power, he and Gantz, to stay in power, even on false pretenses. The only thing that those two parties, i.e. the Likud and Blue and White, are in agreement on is how to steal Palestinian land, how to steal more Palestinian land, and how to oppress the Palestinians even further. I cannot see that the chameleon, i.e. Mr. Netanyahu, will come out of it intact.
So, Mr. Ramini, your point of view that the only thing they have in common is to grab the Palestinian land. I'll come to that point. Do you think this COVID-19 situation, Netanyahu has actually used this one to gain more popularity and win the public trust back?
Oh, of course he does. He uses everything. You must think about the psyche of the Israeli electorate. What they do in Israel, anybody who says, I'm going to kill more Palestinians, I'm going to give you more land, I'm going to give you more space, and take it away from the Palestinians, and never actually use the word Palestinians, they love it. His ratings are sky high. What has he done? He said that he is going to annex the West Bank and the Jordan Valley. And there's a committee, a joint committee, between Israel and the United States of America at the moment, as I speak, working over the details of the so-called deal of the century and how to implement the annexation of most areas of the West Bank and the Jordan Valley. The Palestinians will always be losers in this.
So, Mr. Ramini, how do Palestinians at this point in time, already they have been under siege, especially when we talk about Gazans, and now another sword is hanging in form of COVID-19, and that there was so-called, as you say, the deal of the century in form of the Middle East peace plan. What, at this point in time, the innocent Gazans and the Palestinians feel?
They are desperate. They are in a desperate situation. This is if you talk in particular about Gaza, there is 2 million Gazans who have been living under lock and key for the last 13 years, deprived of everything that makes a decent life possible. Last week, the Israeli occupation forces spread pesticides over the land in Gaza, and they shot at fishermen in the sea. They want to get rid of the Palestinians by any means possible. They do not care because they know that the world is now very busy with the coronavirus and they are not looking at them. Even if they're looking at them, history tells us and their record tells us they do not give a damn.
Yeah, Mr. Ramini, you're of the view that the Israelis don't give any care to what exactly happens with the Palestinians, and they are adamant on grabbing the Palestinian territories. Mr. Burton, what at this point in time, when the Gazans had been already under siege, and now the COVID-19 pandemic and the outbreak amid this whole situation, and there is a political stalemate inside Israel as well, how do you equate the whole situation?
Yeah. Well, the problem with Gaza has been sort of an ongoing one. I mean, they have been subjected to a blockade and a siege for over 15 years, at least 15 years now. And so, they are, the Israelis would sort of like to say that they would allow in humanitarian supplies and aid, but of course they control what's possible to go in and what goes out. And then, of course, what you have is, a very sort of, difficult situation for the health system within Gaza that's going to be able to respond and manage that process. But also, let's keep in mind that, when you asked about sort of what this means in relation to the Israeli government, I mean, we have been in a state of flux, for about a year now. Israel has had 3 elections since April last year. And it is effectively in a political crisis. That does not mean, of course, that there isn't some kind of direction from the top. Israel has been sort of on a political trajectory and shift over the last 20 odd years, which has seen the left, as represented by the Labour Party, almost disappear. And what you effectively have is sort of shades of right. So a right-wing option, which is Netanyahu, and a centre-right option, which is Benny Gantz. And that's been, as your previous comment, contributor pointed out, it's just when it comes to the sort of the so-called deal of the century by Trump, when it comes to what Gantz and Netanyahu are negotiating, it's not so much about whether or not to have annexation of parts of the West Bank, but just how long it will take for that to happen.
How long it would take to have those Palestinian lands in the ambit of Israel. That is what exactly you think Benny Gantz and Netanyahu are negotiating on. Mr. Guy Burton, Middle East expert, joining us from Brussels. Thank you for your time. Mr. Jafar Ramini, analyst and author and political commentator, was joining us from Perth. Thank you for your time as well. With this, we come to the end of today's Newswire. With more in-depth analysis on the major happenings from around the world, we'll be back with you tomorrow. Till then, take good care.